Good morning to everyone. Firstly, let me thank to BOJ for having me here. It's really an honor for me to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and dear friends, today we gather to pay tribute to one of the most influential figures in the world of monetary policy. Our distinguished guest has wielded a subtle yet powerful influence that has shaped and guided monetary policy decisions in every major central bank around the world for over 2 decades. Allow me to take you back to 1992 at Stanford University, where a simple matrix comprised of only 3 variables came into existence. And its purpose was quite simple, just to describe the actions of the Federal Reserve. Was it sunny day or late afternoon? That's a tale for John Taylor to share with us. What we do know is that shortly after its inception, economists, academics, and central bankers worldwide meticulously analyzed, adjusted, and refined the variables of this rule to provide analysis and guidance on monetary policy. And there is a long list of accolades for the Taylor rule. I would like to highlight two only from within the European Central Bank, the bank which I know best. According to Mario Draghi, our warrior leader, the rule played as a crucial role in guiding the ECB's policy decisions and contributed to the stability of the euro area economy. Our current boss, Christine Lagarde, she emphasized its profound influence, how instrumental it was in shaping the ECB's approach. So these are just drops in the sea of well-deserved recognition. John has published pioneering work spanning rational expectations, wage and price dynamics, econometrics, international monetary and fiscal policy, and even the death penalty. Yet many of his students remember him for much different reasons. John has always cherished the classroom, developing innovative teaching techniques that serve as models for the Stanford curriculum. So he knew how to captivate his students' attention, and I'm pretty confident that he will do the same for us today. One might wonder or speculate how his classroom creativity would fare in the halls of central bank. Today we convene to explore his vast insights on navigating the complexities of the global economy. Globalization is weakening, is retreating, and advanced technologies on other sides are rising. So both markedly are reshaping our landscape. And today we face the challenge to foster worldwide growth in this rapidly changing environment, and it's a pivotal moment here. Which brings me to the $1 million question. How do we cultivate the necessary conditions for global prosperity amidst the surmounting obstacles in our path? Through regulation and discretion, we possess, as a central bank, as the means to navigate these turbulent waters. And here, the rules are an exceptional partner for all of us. For John, rules are the ultimate guide for monetary policy formulation. And I think this approach rings true even today. Unforeseen events demand nuanced responses, akin to gusts of wind disrupting the economic landscape. And what is John preaching in this regard? Firstly, the sole reliance on reactive measures is risky. And therefore, a systemic approach complemented by judgment remains essential. In short, simplicity. Simplicity in policy remains paramount. And John's contribution to central banking reaffirms this principle and underscores its enduring relevance. So, as he aptly puts it, simplicity in policy is crucial. So, and now, without further delay, John, please, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very kind and generous introduction. It was a pleasure to sit there and listen to you, not the words I normally hear. It's good to be back here at the Bank of Japan. So many times in the past, I have good memories of being here. I just mentioned a few things. My two kids went to Seinan Shigaka. You might know about that. Some of you from Japan might know. They were little kids. They're now grown-ups. We had such a warm set of hosts. It was just wonderful. We lived in Aoyama. I don't know where the Bank of Japan guests live now, but it was a wonderful place, and we met people, and we enjoyed our stay tremendously. So I thank you for that, and I thank all of you for that. It was a tremendous, tremendous opportunity, and it's maybe part of the reasons why I did what I've done. I don't know, but seeing another central bank in action was a real privilege. Today I'm going to talk about the topic which is actually similar to what I talked about before. I gave the inaugural address here at the Bank of Japan. It was called The Way Back to Stability and Growth in the Global Economy. My title is not too much different from that, The Way to Stability and Growth in the World Economy. And a major concern at that conference was reflected in my speech, I think, was not so much potential deflation at the time, was potential inflation. And you could hear the governor describing some of the aspects of that made it difficult for Japan. A major concern there was really inflation. And in my trying to address this issue, I referred a lot to Governor Mayekawa. His lecture listed as major problems that Taylor identified in his speech in 1979, 1984. And he noticed the differences, as later on I stressed the importance of a comprehensive Mayekawan approach. We forget about that. And outlined those in my speech. I think I have a chart of that, if I can see which button to push. So this is down, okay. These at the bottom of this page were the issues which I thought from Governor Mayekawa's speech were important, and he mentioned at the time. One is we have a problem of high and rising global inflation, as written quite a while ago. We had financial instability risks. Does that sound familiar? We had high and rising prices of energy, food, and many other commodities, not always the same. We had continuing current account imbalances. That sound familiar? We had globally inconsistent exchange rate policies. That sounds familiar. And quite frankly, what sounds too familiar today was rising protectionism and even an isolationist sentiment. So these 6 issues, which are my approach to taking my Mayekawan approach and listing them as problems that we need to face, are quite clear. As he stressed in the last point, and many of this is international, and I think to some extent what I'd like to do this morning is talk a little about the international aspect, because I think they're so important as we come together, as Japan comes together to think about what we're doing. And the 6 concerns resonate strongly, as I say in my notes. Once again, today's economic, political, and geopolitical conjuncture. And I would suggest the holistic Mayekawan approach remains badly needed to find the best policy paths going forward. And I'd like to endeavor in my lecture this morning to explain why that's the case. Let me begin by this chart, which is, as far as I know, is up to date. It's the interest rate, call money rate, interbank rate for the Bank of Japan, you can see it was above zero, got below zero. Now it's just recently risen above zero. So that's the kind of change that Governor Ueda was referring to. And I tend to focus a lot on interest rates as a method of evaluating policy. It's not the only part, but you can see this is a big change over the last few years. And in some sense, that's the thing that I want to stress. As you go and you think about this policy in a global context, you realize that this is not the only time people have talked about rules. This is a chart from the Federal Reserve Monetary Policy Report. The Taylor rule is there, is listed as first. It's not the first time it was there. It was put in, it was taken out, it was put in, it was taken out. Now it's back in. And I think there's some sense in which maybe we're going back towards this. And I'll talk a little bit about this. The Taylor Rule 93, which we referred to already, is there. The balanced approach rule, all variants in the same thing, just the Taylor Rule. And so they're the same kind of thing. So this is in the Federal Reserve's report, and it's not the only central bank, of course, that refers to these things. And we don't know exactly why they're there. I'm not in the FOMC. I'm not sure why they're there, but they're there. And I think that's an important aspect of thinking about policy. Maybe we'll have some discussion about that as we go forward. But I think these are an example of, these are all simple. How could you get more simple than this? Simple ways to try to relate the actual policy to what's happening. Now, let me also mention the change in policy. I'll focus on the Fed for the time being. Near zero, now it's a little over 5, 5.25, 5.5. And that's a fairly substantial rise in interest rates. And to some extent, this rise occurred, I think at least, because the Fed was behind the curve in terms of raising the rate, and finally got close to the curve again, if you like. Maybe it's too high, maybe I think it's about right, but there's debate about that at the Fed. So this is a substantial change in policy, and it's affected policy globally. We'll talk a little bit about that. And so I think to some extent we're thinking about policy in the United States and the other countries. That's a world economy in this context, but this is the first thing to notice. The second thing is the so-called Taylor rule, which I've got a couple versions of just for you to think about. The first one is frequently mentioned. The interest rate, federal funds rate, usually is equal to the inflation rate plus a half times the real GDP gap plus a half times the difference between inflation rate and 2 and 2. And if you can see, if the inflation rate is 2, P equals 2, and the gap is 0, then the interest rate is about 4%. So we're a little bit above this now at 5.25 or so, but it's sort of like the policy that I've been recommending for 30 plus years. And you can, maybe things should be in there that aren't in there. Maybe the exchange rate is important to have in there. Maybe other things are important. Maybe it's not the right coefficients. There's a lot of things you can debate about this. But I think the main thing, and what I want to emphasize in these remarks this morning, is to some extent, can we find a policy like this? Not exactly the same, but is there something that's similar that we can think, not just for the Fed, this is just the Fed, but for the Bank of Japan and other countries around the world. So let me just mention a little bit about how this has affected policy in the United States. This is the federal funds target range, upper limit or lower limit. And you can see it was increasing there in 2017, 2018. Then it came down to near 0 and was held to close to 0. We all know about that, probably influenced central banks generally. And then the recent rise, taking it a little over 5%, is really a demonstrable change in policy. And so I made a big point of this, made a big point of the increase that we've seen recently, as well as the very low rates we saw before then. But I think these are the facts. These are the data that the Fed publishes. This is actually from St. Louis. This is another picture which comes from Jim Bullard. And it's called, from an article, Is Monetary Policy Sufficiently Restrictive? This is back to 2019, goes up to the present. And you can see the policy rate is in blue. You can see the recommended policy rate recommended a so-called generous Taylor type rule. And then the very dotted lines are hard to see, or a less generous rule. But no matter how you measure it, the rate was too low. And you can say, well, other things were going on. It wasn't just monetary policy, it was fiscal policy, other things were going on. But the truth is, this is the biggest gap we've seen in a long time. We can debate that, we can try to understand why it's occurred. But I think if I didn't begin with this as a demonstration of where policy can go wrong, I would be missing something. I've emphasized this from the day one. And to some extent, this maybe has influenced other central banks. We don't know. One thing to discuss is the Bank of Japan. If you look at the impact of this is the inflation rate in the United States, domestic product deflator, implicit price deflator. It goes back to the 1960s. You can see the very high inflation rates we had. Originally, they came down to reasonable rates, 2.5%, 3%. And then you see this increase recently, which 3.6% is an understatement. It went higher than that. It went to 9.1%, depending on how you measure. So this was the measure of inflation, which somehow the Fed didn't keep track of. We don't know exactly the reasons for that. We can debate it. But I think this is the implication, one implication at least, of the fact that policy was too low over here. It raised inflation rate above what they thought would be the appropriate thing to do. And now, of course, as you see in this chart, there's an attempt to undo that at the Federal Reserve and other central banks as well. If you could just look at the possibly the instigator of this is the unemployment rate in the U.S. You can see it got up to almost 15%. That's a big amount. There were other things going on besides monetary policy. And monetary policy reacted to that. You can see they did. This is just the unemployment rate. This is not the reaction itself. This is part of the reaction that was caused by this increase. If you maybe I'll just finish with this. I think this is a global phenomenon more than we've seen in the past. We can debate that. We can discuss it. This is an ideal place to do that. These are broader-based measures from Latin America, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Peru, Latin American 5. And the inflation rate is over on the left. You can see it's increased for all. It's increased for all. Now, maybe that's because the Fed got behind the curve, so other central banks got behind the curve. We don't know exactly about the reasons for this, but it's possibly a reason that the world at this point has problems in general. And we heard from Governor Ueda some of the issues that are facing the Japanese economy as we forward. This is just Latin America, the neighbor of the U.S. So let me that's my main message, is we have to fix our policy rule. And other central banks are maybe coming to that. Maybe all central banks don't agree with that. Maybe it's becoming more common. But I think that's an issue that we need to think about. I will just use this as a summary. What I've tried to do in my charts, and the charts speak thousands of words, is shown the Fed and other central banks got behind the curve. That's pretty clear. Based on a rules-based policy, is not the only one that's existed. And they did this in the United States, and I showed you some sense in which they've done it in other countries. And the paper, which will be in the volume, has outlined a method to get back, how to get back by reviewing the years leading up to the present monetary situation. The paper provides a background needed for analyzing the current and future monetary policy decisions. It's not just an empty set of words. So in some sense, using actual data, which I've tried to do here, the paper points to high inflation data from other parts of the world, namely Latin America, but that's not the only place to point to. As I showed in the figure, one of the figures I've shown, countries in South America have gotten behind the curve, and so perhaps this is a time to reinstitute some kind of a policy rule. And the same is true with many other countries in many places of the world. So let me just conclude with this slide, which really conveys many of the ways I'm thinking about this. So are we entering a new high era of inflation? Well, some are worried about it, some are not. I'd say the answer is yes, unless we have a policy, and I'm focused on monetary policy pretty much here completely, to adjust. I think there are more reasons now than ever for central banks to use a more rules-based policy. It doesn't have to be perfect. I started using rules many, many years ago, had good rules, simple rules, faraway rules. So it's important that there's some kind of a strategy or rule that the central bank can refer to. The policy interest rate, no matter what rule you have, would increase as inflation rises, and that's already happened in the U.S. I've shown you that in the case. They got behind the curve, they got in front of the curve. Now they seem to be pretty close to the front of the curve. And of course, there's a contingency plan. It's not just in the absence of anything else that's going on with inflation. And I think if the Fed, and should I even mention the rest of the world, thinks in these terms, we would be better off. And so that's the real question. Is it somehow a strategy? It's not perfect. Is it a strategy that if not just the U.S., who seems to be close to following it now, they have it in their reports, but the BOJ, Europe, Russia, China, all over the place. If that's the kind of thing that we should be working for, I think that's a real accomplishment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for very insightful the lecture. June, I have the privilege with the first question.
Okay, good.
So, and I will start with the taboo, maybe. And this taboo is about coordination, because, okay, we do live in increasingly interconnected global economy. And how important is that for central banks to coordinate their policies? So, or do you think there is what kind of mechanism would you suggest to enhance international monetary policy cooperation? This is my first question.
The question is cooperation. Can you hear me okay? Cooperation important. I think it's very important. Yes. Sorry. Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Is cooperation important? And I think to some extent it is. It's not just point for point. It's not just ignoring everything else except a few policies like in the so-called Taylor rule. But I think it is very important. In fact, as I think about the world right now, what is our problem? Why do we have high inflation in Russia and China? Why do we have reasonably better inflation in the U.S.? What's going to happen with Japan? It's a whole set of...
Close, please.
Sorry. Whole set of issues. I'm used to talking like this. By the way, I teach a class. This is of Economics 1 at Stanford. It's the third edition. No, 10th edition of my textbook. How about 10th edition? I recommend it all to you. It's used pretty well, and the kids seem to like it. Not the only book. But anyway, I'm usually talking like this, but it's nice to talk up close to the mic too. But I think it's very important to have some notion of coordination. It's, just what the Bank of Japan does cannot be completely separate from what the U.S. does or other central banks. And I think that to some extent what we are gravitating here towards, this is what I've tried to emphasize in my remarks, is that there's maybe a way to have a more coordinated, and I don't want to use coordinated in a really formal sense, that I've been working on this for many years. There's some sense which you have an ability to adjust the interest rate and adjust other elements of policy so that they're in touch. And I should say one thing I didn't mention in my remarks that I maybe should have is other kind of policies. There's fiscal policy, there's international policy, and they all go together. And I just focus on monetary policy. I think if we got monetary policy right, it would be a real accomplishment. I don't think we are there at this point. But if we also use the same approach to fiscal policy and to international policy more generally, I think we'll be in better shape. So I think the notion of coordination is very important. Also, the world has been becoming more integrated. There's no question about that. All of you and I travel around the world, you can see that. It's quite a bit of integration, and there's a lot of similarity. The language is similar. I can't tell you how many countries refer to the Taylor rule. I don't know why, but they have it out there and they talk about it. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, and now we are ready, I think, for other questions. If we are not yet, I'll put the second question from my side, and please. Okay. But my second question is about, and maybe I'm biased by the ECB, because in ECB we are quite known as innovative, and you are advocating proactive or preemptive policy or preemptive steps. What we should do just to be to mitigate the impact of future economic shocks, and do you think that our policy toolkit is sufficient enough from this point of view?
So one thing, I've focused a lot on monetary policy here. That's one aspect of policy. There's fiscal policy, there's international policy, there's regulatory policy more generally. So I focused only on monetary policy because I think that's so important right now. If we could have, where did 2% come from? 2% is the goal. What about 1? What about 3? Well, 2 is sort of a nice round number people can think about. It's not -2, it's not 0, it's 2. And so it's a number that you could imagine people coming together with, and they have to some extent already. So that's the first step, if you like, of having some kind of a policy strategy or rule. And then you have, well, how much do I adjust interest rate? Maybe before that, is it the money supply? Why did you focus so much on the interest rate? I used to focus on the money supply all the time. But the way I've communicated more with central bankers is through the interest rate. So it'll be the interest rate, and then I think about what should the interest rate do? Well, it's got to react to inflation. It can't just be neutral. It can't be 0. It can't go the reverse direction. How much should it react? Should it react like 1.5 times the inflation rate, which I have? And then, of course, is what you do about the state of the economy, the real economy, and there's more debates about that. And there's other variables. Should the exchange rate be taken into account? So I think my sense is if we have a discussion about these things, and some people say the coefficient on inflation is too high, too low, they'll have a better ability to come to the right answer.
Thank you very much. And now, Professor Orphanides, please, is ready to put the question.
Thank you, Peter. John, wonderful to hear you try to convince the central bankers of the world to keep doing this. We still haven't gotten there. Two things. One remark, your call for global cooperation is very well made, and actually reminded me that at the 2019, as I recall, Mayekawa lecture, Jean-Claude Trichet had actually called for 2% to be a global standard on inflation and explain the benefits for that, which is a starting point. And then the next thing, which is along the lines of what you're suggesting, is we need to have systematic policy towards the 2%. And clearly, a number of central banks failed. Now, starting with the Fed in 2021, as he showed from Jim Bullard's slide. And one question is, at the time and since then, a number of people have said, but it was exceptional circumstances and inflation expectations were so incredibly well anchored, so why not deviate from the rule and let us get a little bit more in terms of high growth and employment. So could you say a little bit about what's wrong with that argument? Because the Fed started it, and then a number of other central banks followed, pretty much with the same point.
So I think this is a very good question, is what motivates central banks to do what they do? And what I've tried to emphasize in these remarks and other places is that why not focus on some strategy or some rule which you can communicate? And I think 2% is an example of that. It wasn't always around. If I had a question, where do you go after that? And there is a question, I guess, to some central banks, should I bother at all? Why not just wing it? I think we're beyond winging it. We're beyond that strategy. We're beyond that kind of method, and we're looking for a better method. And maybe money supply is part of this. I don't know. I tend to focus on the interest rate. You don't have to do that, but I think the interest rate is an important ingredient. That's what the so-called Taylor rule is about, and that gives you a sense of where to go. And maybe it should be a different direction. I don't know. I think I found the interest rate procedure a reasonable way to go, and I think it applies to other central banks. It's very common, as you know, that there's some reference to the interest rate. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Well, it's the one aspect that I'm still curious about is then some central bankers defending being behind the curve by saying inflation expectations are continuing to be anchored. So why do more than we have to, since we still have well-anchored inflation expectations? And I wonder what the rules-based response to that would be.
Well, that's what they said. And so you can see the reasons. And they, as they said, they were on, off, on, now they're back on. And that's this very specific statement. And so I think the question is maybe the fact that we're on looks a little better. We're not out of the water yet. Is some indication that some kind of a rules-based strategy works. Doesn't have to be exactly one for one, but something like that works. And I think that's the. And so I think the real answer to your question is what we went through, what the Fed went through, what other central banks went through. Is that enough of a lesson that helps you guide policy going forward? And I think it is. I think that's why I had two charts that reflected on that. Thank you.
Thank you too. Also, Thomas Jordan, please.
Well, thank you very much, John, for this really impressive lecture. I have a lot of sympathy, of course. You also, at the Swiss National Bank, reacted a little bit early, so inflation was never above 3.5%. Nevertheless, I have a question that goes a little bit in the same direction as Athanasios. So we have this rule-based approach, but we have a lot of uncertainty. We can never be sure what actually the situation is and whether following the rule is better than having a discretionary decision. Could you give us a little bit of advice whether we should always just follow the rule or whether there is really a necessity for central banks to look at the specific situation very carefully and then to make a decision a little bit in this kind of risk management approach when we have to elaborate when we err on one side, where is the error bigger, and then take a decision that could potentially deviate from a Taylor rule. Thanks.
So it's a very important question, is how much discretion do you add to what seems to be a reasonable rule? Maybe it's not even reasonable. I think that's an ongoing question. There's lots of issues. Should the exchange rate, I didn't have the exchange rate in the rule at all. That's an issue which many countries need to worry about. But I think the issue is, let's try. Let's see how it works. We have models around the world that apply to different organizations, different central banks, different combinations of central banks. You have also the coordination. Does it make a difference if one central bank changes, another central bank changes? Does it make a difference that the U.S. seemed to be so behind the curve that influence other central banks too? So that should be part of the analysis, I think. But I think what I'm arguing, obviously, is that some kind of rules-based strategy works better. It's not just seat of the pants, not just do whatever you want to do. It is some strategy. That, after all, Milton Friedman was one of the people I worked with quite a bit at Stanford. He was a money growth rule. In some sense, a rule or a strategy comes out of that way of thinking about things. You can monitor, you can look at what's happening. And interest rates, which I focused on, tend to be a little simpler than that. Everybody's talking about that, or they talk about M1 or M2. And so I think that's the way to go. I think it's a judgment call. It should be M1, M2, or interest rates, which interest rates, what about long-term interest rates? I didn't talk about that. I think that's the issue that we all need to be worrying about going forward.
Thank you. And that next question is from the audience. I think Mr. Aoki, please.
Thank you very much. This is Kosuke Aoki from the University of Tokyo. And thank you very much for your nice lecture. And my questions are following. So based on the recent inflation experience, I'd like to hear your opinion on the desirability of history-dependent monetary policy. Because yes, especially subject to zero bound, optimal policy calls for overshooting of inflation. And that's what we academics teach our students. But as we know, policymakers were criticized by behind the curve recently. So therefore, based on this kind of experience, did we overemphasize the benefit of overshooting properties of optimal history-dependent policy? Thank you.
So, as I understand your question, I don't think it's a good idea to overemphasize overshooting. You want to keep it as close as you possibly can, including the people working at the central bank and other central banks as well. Central banking is a global issue. There's lots of discussions. So right now we have people from different central banks in different countries involved. So I think it's important to get it as right as possible. I'm always interested in models. Models are part of this. Models have been less popular recently, but that's certainly a way to go to get a better answer. And maybe it's something completely different, and we should allow other things come into play. But I think the main thing is to have models, strategies, different ways to evaluate, ways that you can understand which works better, which doesn't work better. Try 3%, try 4%, see if 2% is better than that. And there's some debate that the Fed maybe should be 3% or 4%. So 2% it seems to be a reasonable number, but if it's 2, why do you react by 1.5, not 2 times, when the inflation rate goes above its target? Why do you not react at all? Maybe we need a real serious study of what happened at the Fed, and we don't, other things possibly are the reason for that, and we could understand that better. I think it's a type of issue which we all need to study.
Madam Minister, please, your question.
So John, you have more students than you know, because I never had the pleasure of taking a course with you, but I've learned a lot from you and your writing, so thank you. So I guess I have a question for you. This thing about discretion and central banks not wanting to give up their discretion is a really big one, I think. Because when you're in the middle of having to make a decision, right, there are all these other things going on. So I wonder if we could get closer to where we need to get to in terms of systematic, is if we could change the way we communicate about our policy. So in other words, use the rules as a real benchmarking. And so when you go out and give a talk, you always benchmark to the rule. So, and then you have to be forced to explain when you're deviating from the rule. Because it's going to be really hard, I think, for a central banker, a governor, to really stick to a rule, because there are all these competing things. And of course, the pandemic was hopefully unprecedented, and we don't live through another one. But, that's a situation where there was a lot of things pulling you in different directions. And I was wondering whether that would be an approach that you would say would be maybe you would call it a baby step, but at least a step in the right direction. And how far could we get if we did that?
Well, it's certainly worth thinking about. I think at this point we have rules that work pretty well. They're not perfect. They're not, 2% target for inflation. You react by a certain amount when inflation goes above its target. You look at the unemployment rate, and maybe an exchange rate, and there's debates about that, as you know very well from various committees and how you operate. But I think the main thing is to have something out there which not just the United States, but other countries can think of as a reasonable way to proceed, and debate that. Try to shoot it down. Try to do what you can. Maybe promote it, as other people are trying to do. But I don't know if I fully understand your question, but somehow you want to have, you're asking why can't you have a rule or a strategy that everybody likes? I think you can't. It's different approaches. But I think what we've learned over the last maybe 30 years or something, maybe less than that, we've learned that deviating is not the best thing to do, and sticking to the strategy seems to be best. It's not perfect. You don't know exactly whether it should be 25 basis points, 50 basis points, or whatever it happens to be. Other central banks don't as well. And then I'd say one other thing which is very important for this gathering is, what about other central banks? What do you do with the Bank of Japan or the Bank of Canada or the European Central Bank doesn't do exactly what you think is right? Well, it's a more global thing. And so I think there you have to have a degree of independence of the central banks saying this is the right thing to do. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you. Next is from the audience, Mr. Iwata. Mr. Iwata, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I have one question. How about your view on the U.S. neutral rate? The Federal Reserve set the neutral rate at the 2.6% now, And recently, former Treasury Secretary Mr. Summers argues now it's moved up to 4%. And today, I see your simple version of the Taylor rules. It seems to me you are adopting the view of 4% neutral rate. But my question is, delayed action by the Federal Reserve is related to this setting the neutral rate too low.
So as I understand it, the question is what went wrong? I think it was wrong in the period where the rates were very low. And the question is, should have been a higher inflation rate target? Should they just have stuck to it? Should they have ignored the political pressures, which were certainly upon them? I don't really know about those personally. I think those are real questions that make monetary policy more difficult. And whether your target is 4% or 5%, some people are talking about the central bank just leaving it alone at this point and letting it come down. But I think that the point is you have a rate which is certainly higher than most people think is a good idea, 5.5% or whatever, 5%, 3%. And so you have a goal that this is a society is involved as much as they can be, and that's why it's important to have a discussion with academics and other kind of policymakers around the world about these issues.
Thank you very much. Now, please, Olli Rehn, please.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Professor Taylor, for a very stimulating lecture. I would have one question which aims at it's a simple question and aims at clarifying concepts, at least for me. And this relates to the strategy reviews that many of the central banks are conducting. We did a strategy review at the European Central Bank last in 2020-21 in 15 months, 15 PhD seminars as part of that process. And as a consequence of that, we left behind our previous target, which was below but close to 2% inflation, which was considered a ceiling. And we opted for a revised target, which is a symmetric medium-term target. Has basically three elements. Symmetric around 2%, considers deviations up or down as undesirable, and it is very clearly of a medium-term orientation. In my view, this has served us quite well. Inflation was about 10 in October 22. Now it's 2.4, and it's stabilizing towards 2%. So my simple question is, do you count this strategy as a rule in a way that you discussed it in your lecture? I'm asking this because we are just about to start our next review, which will be done next year. Thank you.
So I think reviews, as you describe it, are very valuable to have. I can't imagine how we wouldn't be able to conduct policy without. The world is changing. There's different things going on. There's more integration. There's less integration. So I think that's very important to do. And the next time you do the study, it'll be different. Other times, other central banks do the study, it'll be different. So I think it's very important. And it's not just central banks, by the way. It's academics, it's people in the private sector more generally. They should be doing this as well. You should think about the commentators from abroad. They all have things to say. And so when you bring that more broad perspective into play, then I think you always want to look for a better approach. Why not look for a better approach? Look for a better approach in tax policy, regulatory policy, et cetera. Why not monetary policy too?
Thank you. And now from audience, please, Mr. Wakatabe.
Thank you very much for a very nice lecture. It's quite an honor to listen to about the Taylor rule from the originator of the Taylor rule. My question is about the applicability of the Taylor rule to Japan in particular. So the Bank of Japan has been trying to raise inflation expectations and to re-anchor the inflation expectations at the 2% level. So when that is the case, can we really rely on the Taylor rule when we haven't yet reached the inflation expectations at 2% level? So that is actually a pertinent question to the current policy discussions. Some would argue that the BOJ should raise short-term interest rates more aggressively, depending on rely on the simple calculation of Taylor rule. But I'm a little bit concerned about the applicability of the Taylor rule, where the inflation expectation not well anchored at 2% target level. Thank you very much.
So I think whether it sounds like 2% is becoming more and more common, I think that's a place to focus the attention, but why not try 1, 2, 3, et cetera? But I think the main thing is try different things out. This is not rocket science. This is difficult to do. So you try different things out, and you try different central banks, and some are larger, some are smaller, some are less integrated than others. So you try out different things, and the so-called Taylor rule didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of thinking about policy of various central banks, and that's the way to go. I think you have to do this in a way that's systematic. You know, it could be more complicated than a so-called policy rule like interest rate, which your question addresses. But I think that's the main thing to focus on this is not over. This is not finished. This is an issue which we need to discuss further, and central banks around the world need to discuss it. We have not licked inflation. Let's face it. We have. I just showed you the chart of Latin America. What about China? What about Russia? And so we have a lot of things to think about more generally.
Mr. Remolona, please.
Thank you. Professor Taylor, I think your argument for a rules-based monetary policy is compelling, especially because it's easy for markets to understand. But I think now central banks tend to exercise discretion on not the rule itself, but on the smoothing parameter for the interest rates. We call it forward guidance, as we kind of try to tell the markets what the smoothing parameter is. And I think in the smoothing parameter, what's built into it is a tendency to fall behind the curve, because you don't want to go to the target right away. You want to kind of test the waters. Is that okay? Is that something you would support?
So
Does that make sense?
My simple formulas didn't have lags of any kind. And so the real world is there's lags. There's trying to get a group of people together to think about the right thing to do. So that's always there. But I think the main thing is to think about the overall strategy. Is it the right direction? Is it the wrong direction? And I appreciate your remarks, your sensitivity to the issue, but it's very difficult to determine. And what should be the best strategy for a country? Countries are different. And you have to think about this differently in different countries. But I think that's the way I would think about this. I'm obviously not an expert in many countries, or any countries at all. And so you think about how that maybe the inflation rate is too high for this country, that country. And so you think about it, alternative ways to do it.
Now I would like to ask from the audience, Mr. Yoshino, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Yoshino from Keio University. Causes of the inflation sometimes come from aggregate demand side. But in Japanese case currently, commodity prices are pushing up aggregate supply. Depreciation is also pushing up aggregate supply. If the inflation is caused by aggregate supply, we have to push down the aggregate supply curve. Then total factor productivity has to be increased, much more structural. If aggregate demand is shifting up, then monetary policy may be suitable. So my question is, what are the causes of the inflation might change the policy rule? Thank you.
So it's a very important question. Should it be 2%, 3%, 4%, whatever? It has to do with your estimate of potential GDP growth, and that's not absent from this discussion. And so your question is really, what is the overall supply potential of the economy? Is it 2%, 3%, 4%? And that's a very important question to come to answer. And it's not just monetary policy, it's all kinds of policies. But I think that's very important. And if you think supply is going the wrong way, why? Is it because there's some regulation that's causing it? Maybe you should work on that. If there's other things that are going on. But I think the main thing that I've focused on, haven't delved into it as much as I should, is what really is the source of the increase in supply. Why is supply growing faster in some countries than others? And is that okay? Of course it's okay. And so some countries are poorer and richer. And so you have to bring that into play. That's one of the difficulties in thinking of this whole thing internationally. But it's a very important question.
Thank you. And it seems to me that finally, Mr. Charles Evans, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I've always been a big fan of the research that John has done and the Taylor Rule. I remember going to Carnegie Rochester conference a year after John gave his famous paper there, and I made an intervention from the audience about a Rich Clarida paper that had a VAR policy. Well, he didn't have a VAR policy. He had a policy rule. And I remember kind of going, oh, you know, VARs are very important for capturing all the data that you need to be looking at. And Ben McCallum, my dissertation advisor, said, well, you know, Charles Evans has said it takes a lot of data. Well, John Taylor was here just last year, and he said all it takes is unemployment and inflation, and you can fit, you know, the Fed's policy really very well. This bothered me because it was against the research that I was doing. But, you know, as I studied it and as you looked at it, I mean, this is just very influential research. The VAR work, I thought, was very good at fleshing out implications from the data and how the economy behaves. But policy rules are huge for modeling. And it was at about that time that models really started to take off, and you needed something simple, and a Taylor rule, a variant of that, you know, was really important. And I was always a fan of your 79 Econometrica paper, Estimation and Control, where you solved an optimum problem and came up with an interest rate rule, which was much more involved. I think that as I've looked at in the Federal Reserve policy analysis alternatives, the Board of Governors has usefully adopted this policy rule approach by doing alternative simulations. You need an interest rate rule of some sort, and they've tended to use a balanced approach rule. And by doing that, you can do what-if scenarios. You know, you're looking at the current state of the economy, and it's like, well, what if supply shocks really end up getting caught up with inflation expectations and they're unanchored, and what does that really mean? So I think, you know, Ben Bernanke's most recent recommendation is the Bank of England. My colleague, former colleague, Loretta Mester, was always big on advocating alternative scenarios too, rather than just a baseline projection. And so I think that the policy rule is fundamental for fleshing out more than just baseline scenarios. And perhaps a single policy rule focuses more on just a baseline for the economy. I think when you look at the most recent inflation in the U.S. and around the world, supply shocks are important to take into account. And I think the current experience in the U.S. of 2.8%, I think supply shocks were important. The discipline of getting the policy rate up when it needed to be up, but other things, you know, have been in play as well. And so I think your work has been very influential. I would say it's as much in that analytical side to flesh out these alternatives rather than getting caught up on one precise rule. I think, you know, in that sense, you really won this debate already.
I appreciate those comments. It seems to me, I'm not really addressing it specifically, why not have others? Why not have other strategies or rules? Why just do one? You got lots of employees all over the place. They could do it. I mentioned that the Fed has 6. They could have more. They publish 6, and they debate it. I don't know to what extent they do it. Maybe there should be others, and should be part of the discussion. But I think that's important. I don't want to say there's only one rule. That's for sure. That's crazy. But there's variance on various. I think the idea of a rule is important, but the idea if you have a strategy or a context, you put that in and try to evaluate it. And believe me, you could have more complicated models. You could have new models. You could have completely different models. Why not try out those as well? And so I think be broad-minded about this is the best way to do it.
Okay, that was the last question from the audience, and we do have plenty of time according to schedule. So let me, maybe last question. from me. All we know that the wine ages well, and what about the Taylor rule? If you were to formulate the rule today, would it look the same?
So that's a good question. So Taylor rule things have been what I've been looking at for my whole life. And so I settled on one 30 years ago. It seemed to be, should have captured today, but I don't think it's over. I really think there's lots of things that people should be trying, and different cultures are different as well. So I think it's very important to try out different things, and I would be the first to try to do that. I mean, I do that anyway. I teach, I still teach it as I answered the question before a few minutes ago, but I think it's very important to have research, studies, examples that you're doing in your policy work. And you work with academics, you work with people that are not policymakers, but they're in the private sector, and so they have different perspectives. So I think this is a community type of activity, and I really very much like the openness that I've seen at central banks, and I think that's the way to go.
Thank you. And thank you, and this brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you for your patience with us, and thank you for excellent questions from the audience. Thanks a lot.